Thank you very much, Professor Lynn, for inviting me. As she mentioned, a lot of my work so far has been on questions about public health and ethics, and partly because I'll show it to you. It's come out. I sort of this book came out about a year ago, and after I'd done that book, that's for you. But after I'd written that book, I thought, well, what do I do next? So I was writing some things about ethics and the pandemic, but after that, I realised I wanted to start thinking about a different kind of a topic. And so the paper today is the beginnings of a new project that I'm working on, which is really about ethics. Oh. Yeah, that's better. Yeah, sorry, it's timed out. It's about ethics, aesthetics, and cultural value. And it's really about how and why do we value art and artefacts such as statues or sort of old relics that we find in museums. So it raises some similar questions to the ones that I've already been dealing with in the philosophy of public policy and ethics, but obviously some new ones because I'm talking very much about art and artefacts. So, have a look. Well, you can't sort of fully appreciate this picture from merely looking at a photograph there, but this picture was sold by Sotheby's in London for, £10 million. I think it's about sort of 70 million RMB in 2011. It had been investigated by experts beforehand. Everyone had looked at it. It was sold for this huge sum, but that not long after it was sold, it was discovered that it was a fake. It was a recent forgery, and not just this one was a fake, but that the same group of artists and conmen had been responsible for selling about 10 or 15 other similar, apparently old master paintings, and so that they reckoned that all in all it's well over a billion RMB, has been sold in these fake paintings. So I think there's an initial sort of philosophical puzzle or interest here which I want to build up from. So obviously, in financial terms, after people discover that this painting is a forgery, it's worthless. Nobody wants to pay millions for it anymore. You could maybe sell it for a few hundred. But that after it's discovered to be a forgery, it doesn't look any different. The painting itself had been admired by many people. It had been looked at by experts. Nobody at the time it was sold saw anything that was wrong with it. So people thought it was genuine, people thought it was valuable, they enjoyed looking at it. And so I conclude, at least tentatively, that if it had been a real Franz Hals, if it had actually been painted by the genuine artist, it probably wouldn't have looked any different from that. Or if it had looked different from that, it would have only been very, very subtle. But nonetheless, enormous difference in value. And in order to make progress, it's helpful to distinguish different sorts of value here. So that on the one hand, we have the financial value of the painting. That's how much someone's willing to pay for it. But we can also talk about its aesthetic value in a narrow sense. That's about, well, how beautiful is it, how visually appealing, how striking is the artwork, just in terms of exactly what's on the canvas, what we can perceive. And the third question is going to be about its artistic value. That is, how valuable is it as a work of art? And we'll see shortly that there are cases in which the artistic value of a work can come apart from its aesthetic value. And lastly, we might mention the idea of cultural value, which seems to be a bit broader than both aesthetic and artistic value. That's, roughly speaking, the significance that an artwork or an artifact has to a culture or a way of life or a social group. So I guess a lot of the works that are most celebrated in our biggest museums in the world are cases where we have all these sorts of value in the very same object, so that you think of priceless cultural treasures, maybe the terracotta warriors, or in the British Museum we have the Parthenon marbles, or if you go to Amsterdam you can see Rembrandt's famous painting, The Knight's Watch. But there are cases where these different sorts of value come apart. So this is a very celebrated work of modern art from the 1960s by Joseph Kosuth. basically, well, it's called 1 and 3 chairs. And just to describe what it is you probably can't read, unless you have extremely good writing, you won't be able to read what's on the text. But basically, what you'll see there is that there's in the middle, it's just an ordinary chair. On the left-hand side is a photograph of the same chair, which is the same size as the chair. And on the right is a dictionary definition of a chair. And, well, what are we supposed to make of the work of art? Well, it'd be quite easy to do your own version of it because there's nothing special about the chair, and all you need to do is to take a chair, photograph the chair, make a print of the chair of the same size, and then put a dictionary definition of the chair. And whatever it is that he's trying to do with the work, it doesn't seem to be that much about exactly what the work looks like, because as it happens, he didn't make the chair himself, he didn't even take the photograph. He didn't write the dictionary definition, but the work of art was in putting all those things together. And I guess for those who are philosophy students in the room, you might think that it's a kind of comment on something that Plato says in Book 10 of the Republic, where there's a description of, part of Plato's criticism of art is he thinks that, in order to make an actual bed, you need to have some understanding of the form of the bed, and all that the artist does is copy the physical likeness of the bed, so that art is too removes from reality. So clearly he's sort of playing with that kind of idea. And maybe that's part of why it is people thought it was an interesting and a sophisticated work of art. But what makes it interesting and sophisticated doesn't seem to be that much about its aesthetic value in the narrow sense. As we've all seen chairs before. There's about 50 chairs in this room, and probably none of them are very aesthetically interesting. But put them together in that way, and you have an interesting artwork. And so, I guess this is a central feature of what's happened within a lot of art over the last 100 years or so. So whether sort of Western or Chinese art, classical art often requires a very high degree of training, experience, and skill, and that a lot of the reasons why we admire old master paintings is just because it's just so difficult to paint in the way that the old masters do. But that a lot of what's happened over the last certainly 100 years or so is that the conceptual rather than the sort of aesthetic features of art have increasingly been brought to the foreground. And so for many contemporary artists, their skill or their greatness doesn't lie in what their works look like, but the questions that they're able to ask. Like with Kazooth, it might be questions about the nature of artistic representation or the sorts of experiences they make possible. And so I guess here's another sort of classic example where the artistic value of something comes apart from its aesthetic value. Now, this is Andy Warhol's work, the Brillo boxes. Now, you probably don't see them very much in China, but basically Brillo pads, they're a thing you use for washing saucepans with. And so that Andy Warhol's just thought that the boxes they came with were kind of interesting, and he saw them stacked up in a supermarket. And he made a work looking like someone had stacked up some cardboard boxes containing Brillo pads, and he exhibited it as a work. And that much of what made it an interesting artistic work was what's he trying to do with this, what's he saying about what it is to make an artwork. Very little about the aesthetic interest of those particular cardboard boxes themselves. Oops. Sorry, that's my PowerPoint's gone a bit funny. But there are other cases where something can have a high degree of cultural value, but without, we think, having either high aesthetic value or even high artistic value. And many of the sort of items that we see in museums may be of this sort. So this is, again, it doesn't look like anything very special. That is the exact pen that Abraham Lincoln used to sign the Emancipation Proclamation in the US in 1863, which freed the slaves at the end of the American Civil War. Now, you might think, because of that, it's a really admired, it's a very important object within American history, and so the Yale University Library, which holds it, it's one of their most important things. But that you see it's just a pen. He could have used any pen to sign the Emancipation Proclamation, and whichever pen he'd used, we would now think was important. So that's a case where something seems to have a really high cultural value, but if you'd be missing the point of it if you thought that the pen looked anything special. So that's a sort of primer on some of the ways we think about fakes, forgeries, and value. I wanted to use some of these ideas to begin to interrogate and think about what we do in museums, what it is to display things, in particular to ask questions about how and why it is that it's generally thought that there's something wrong about displaying replicas in museums rather than real old items. So there's an obvious and interesting paradox about things like Lincoln's fountain pen there, or if you go to like a writer's museum or a museum about a famous person, then often they'll collect a variety of things about their life which are presented as important. So it might be, if you go to a museum about a writer, you might see their typewriter, for example, and their typewriter is likely to look exactly the same as anyone else's typewriter. And so the things that are presented as special because of this connection to the famous person, they're usually just sort of completely ordinary items, maybe items that have been mass produced. And so what you see in the museum looks absolutely identical to any other typewriter, any other pen that you could have seen. And because of that, it would probably be impossible to tell just by looking at the things that you see in the museum that there's anything special about them. So that, even if you took that pen or that typewriter out, you couldn't tell from looking at it that it had been used by the great writer or used by Abraham Lincoln. So the sort of question I want us to think about is that, well, why does it matter if you go to the museum whether you actually see Lincoln's real pen or just a replica of the pen which looks very similar to it? Would you lose anything if you saw a replica rather than the real thing? And I think we could ask a similar sort of question about quite a lot of modern art as well. So if you think back to the Brillo boxes, well, Warhol deliberately designed his, as it happened, he made his Brillo boxes out of wood and then painted them. But he could just as well have made them out of cardboard. And does it matter if you, as it were, go to an art gallery and see Warhol's actual Brillo boxes as opposed to someone's replica of the Brillo boxes? Would you get anything additional by seeing the actual ones that Warhol actually made? Now, as an interesting feature of these is that these ones are actually fake Brillo boxes. That there's a massive problem around the world in fake Warhols because he sort of made them for mass production and things that look like mass production. It's really easy to make fakes of them. And these particular ones were displayed, I think it was in a museum in Norway for many years, and before somebody noticed that they were not fake. But even after you realise they're fake, they're still indistinguishable from the real ones, and the real ones themselves are supposed to be indistinguishable from an actual cardboard box. So obviously there are some terracotta warriors which you're probably very familiar with. So in 2007 there was an exhibition of terracotta warriors in Hamburg in Germany. Now, after thousands of people had seen the show, it was 10,000 people had seen the show, it became apparent that what they'd been exhibiting as part of the show were not genuine, the original 2,000-year-old statues, but they were precisely made and accurate modern copies. Now, no one had actually noticed that from looking at the exhibits because they were really precise copies. And it was only noticed when it just became apparent when people looked into, well, who authorised these terracotta warriors to be sent to Hamburg. And it turned out it hadn't been the Chinese authorities in Beijing or Xi'an. And so people thought, well, because nobody's authorised it, they definitely can't be original. People looked into it, and it turned out they were copies. And so the German museum itself then just was profoundly embarrassed. They immediately shut the exhibition and then offered everyone who'd seen it their money back. And it was seen at the time as a bit of a scandal. It was described as the art crime of the decade in one newspaper that I saw. But I think we could ask questions about this. So that there's an interesting article by Byul-Chul Han, who points out that there's something sort of odd about the assumption of Hamburg museums, that there's something shameful or problematic about having displayed replicas. He points out that the original terracotta warriors themselves were manufactured using serial mass production, using modules or components. So when you see them, you realise that they're sort of, that they're different pieces for arms and torsos and bodies, and clearly there was a man or series of men whose job it was to make the legs, and then there's sort of different sorts of legs which were put together with different sorts of bodies and heads. And he points out that the originals were produced by mass production using modules, and he says, well, it's a process that could have been continued. If the moulds that had been made had survived, we could have continued making more of them using the same old moulds. So that his thought is, well, it's a bit weird to complain that these things you're seeing are replica when originally, when the originals were sort of reproduction or certainly mass produced anyway. So I guess this allows us maybe to push a bit harder on this question about, well, what is it that the person who saw these replica terracotta warriors missed that they would have got from seeing the genuine statues if they actually went to Xi'an? Well, I guess it's uncontroversial. There's some things that scientists can get from studying originals, so that, say if archaeologists have access to genuine old items, they might be able to discover things, that there are amazing things that archaeologists can discover from for example, old kind of skeletons or mummies. They can, the science now is very sophisticated. They can tell you things about what people were eating in Egyptian times from looking at the bones or the fingernails or other sort of things from the time. So that there's all sorts of things you might discover epistemically, which give you some sort of insights into a world. But as people who go to art galleries or to museums, that's not the kind of information we usually get. And in any case, it's not the sort of information you can get just by looking at things with your eyes. And so I admit that there are some things that scientists can discover from looking at originals, and they may be of scientific value. But maybe our question is, well, is there anything of either sort of aesthetic or artistic or cultural value that you get from the original that you couldn't get from the replica? So this is, actually it's come out a bit, it's not as long as that if you see the real one. It somehow's got a bit pulled a bit longer in the photo. But this is it's a small horse figure which you can see in the Met Museum in New York. It has a rather sort of intriguing history because the Met Museum in New York acquired it in 1923, and it was, when they bought it, they thought it was about 2,500 years old. And then, if you read the art history criticism of the time, it's praised as a really important example of artwork from that time of the high period of Greek sculpture. So that, just to give one quote, people said it's singularly rhythmical, and the modelling has just the combination of realism and stylisation that gives Greek art of the first half of the 5th century its distinctive character. So people liked it because of those features that it had. But after it had been in the museum for about 30 years, somebody happened to look at it at a different angle from usually, and they discovered something which showed that it couldn't be as old as they thought. Basically, you can't really see it from here, but it's actually, the horse has been cast in two halves. Somebody cast the left-hand side of the horse and then the right-hand side of the horse, then they welded them together. And people didn't know how to do that in 2,500 years ago in Greece. They only discovered how to do that a few hundred years afterwards. So suddenly they realised that the horse couldn't be as old as they thought it was. So there was a number of years when people thought it was just a modern fake, and in which case nobody wanted to exhibit it anymore. People thought it was uninteresting. Having previously thought it was singularly rhythmical, then people thought it was completely uninteresting. But then there's a third attempt to look at it again, and I think this one is now definitive. So on the third examination of it, people concluded that in fact it was genuinely old, but it just wasn't as old as they thought it was to start off with. So they now think it's about 2,200 years old, and that having now been put in a different time period, as the Hellenistic period. The art criticism now suggested the following. They said, well, what we see here is the archaizing style of the late Hellenistic period, and this may account for the horse's lifelessness, a quality foreign to Greek art, which is fascinating when you see that previously the very same item had been looked at by experts, and people thought that what it showed was this combination of this rhythmical combination of kind of style and realism. And I think this is kind of intriguing, and it maybe tells us something about what it is that we tend to bring to works of art when we interpret them. We tend to bring various aspects of background which shape the way that we see them. Now, I mean, one thing we could say by way of criticism, it might just be that some of the art critics who looked at it just weren't very good. They didn't look closely enough. They didn't really look at what the horse was like. But I think there's a more generous thing we might say. I mean, one thing you might say is that, well, understanding an object's story, that's how the object fits into the history of art making, is actually really important for understanding what it is that the object has to tell us, and also the kind of artistic experience it offers it. So the artist, the philosopher Dennis Dutton argues in an important article about the values of artistic fakes. He suggests that what matters most of all for artistic understanding is really, and for artistic values, is coming to terms and properly appreciating what it is that the artist has achieved. And he thinks that understanding an artist's achievement really depends on us knowing what kind of problem did the artist have to solve. And he thinks that partly because of that, the first time somebody does something in art, that makes it a more important artwork than it otherwise would be. And so it's the person who invents a new set of techniques, somebody who's able to start painting in perspective in a way that people hadn't before, or is able to use a kind of technique like sort of a sfumato in sort of almost sort of semi sort of see-through colours in a way that Leonardo da Vinci was able to do. That's a real achievement, to be able to invent that way of seeing the world. But once somebody's already invented that way of seeing the world, there's a much less important achievement in copying that thing or painting in that style. And if Dutton is right about that, then that might provide an explanation of why it is that knowing the date of a sculpture really does make a difference to how artistically important it is, how artistically valuable it is. Insofar as if you think that the person making it is at the heart, one of the very first people to make a certain kind of artistic innovation, then that makes an important work. But if it's rather the case that people have been doing that kind of work for 300 years and what they're doing is just a bit sort of boring and, you know, old hat, as we say in English, then it's a much less important work. So Dutton concludes, and I think he probably is right about this, that, well, changing our understanding of when an object was produced can make a difference to its artistic value, even though obviously the visual appearance of the object remains exactly the same. It's still, as it were, the same horse that they first discovered in 1923. So, some implications of this, so that we realise that sort of genuineness can be a slightly sort of relative category. So that the horse, it turned out to be, was a genuine instance of Hellenistic art, even if it wasn't a genuine instance of classical Greek art. And also it turns out that whether something is old and whether something is genuine are two different sorts of properties. So we realise that something can be genuine but recent, and something can also be fake but ancient. So if you look into the history, an intriguing feature is that, well, people have been making counterfeit and fake coins and art for nearly as long as they've been making genuine art. So unfortunately we've lost it, but that Michelangelo famously made a forgery of a Roman statue, which he sold in 1496. The statue was unfortunately destroyed in a fire a couple of hundred years later, but that, you know, by all accounts it was an extremely good statue, and I assume if the statue had survived, then we'd now think of it as definitely an ancient work, a genuine work by Michelangelo, even if it had been true, even though it would also be true that it was a fake Roman statue. So that, as it were, I suspect we might think it was a great work of art, you know, because it was a genuine Michelangelo, even though it was a fake Roman statue. So I want to pass now to think a little bit about more sort of what is it that we go to museums for? And the scholar Stephen Greenblatt makes a helpful distinction with people who construct museum exhibitions have found very helpful between what he describes as resonance and wonder. And he says that resonance is the power of the displayed object to reach out beyond its formal boundaries to a larger world, to evoke in the viewer the complex, dynamic cultural forces from which it has emerged, and for which it may be taken by a viewer to stand. So I guess an example for that, we went on a tour earlier in the week to the Shanghai sort of Jewish refugee museum, and some of the exhibits there you can see that they're sort of everyday items from the time. So that whether sort of a basket that somebody had used for carrying their child, and the fact that that was a basket that somebody had used to carry their child to flee away from the Nazis, and you can see it there, the very same basket. It has a sort of quite a powerful resonance. It's still jolted and brought face to face with the item itself. So that's resonance. But he suggests we also go to museums for what he describes as wonder. He says that wonder is the power of the displayed object to stop the viewer in his or her tracks, to convey an arresting sense of uniqueness, to evoke an exalted attention. So that it might be something you go and see, so it might be an extraordinary item, like maybe it's made out of sort of gold or jade, and you're just sort of stunned by an old crown, for example, in a museum, where you're just sort of wondering at how somebody could make such a beautiful item or with such skill. And he suggests that often we go for both of these things at museums, but maybe it's difficult to combine the two at the same time. And so one question for us is really, well, how do these experiences of resonance and wonder relate to the idea of genuineness? I'm going to suggest that it's often the case that resonance and wonder require genuineness, but maybe they don't always do, and that might give us a way to think differently about what it is that we do in museums and provide a more positive role for replicas. So many of the things that we do see in museums, particularly sort of museums of everyday life or museums of historical interest, many of the things that you see displayed in collections, that they might not be aesthetically remarkable in and of itself, so that this sort of old basket that somebody carried their child in, it doesn't look much. It's only when you hear the story of it that you realise what it means. So perhaps they make vivid something about a particular kind of aspect of the world, or sort of having been in the Shanghai Museum, you saw that here's a scythe that somebody made out of jade or out of stone, and it gives you a sort of insight into what life must have been like at that particular time in China. But the one question we can ask is, well, do you actually require real objects, the real genuine old objects, in order to get us to this experience of resonance? Maybe a replica will sometimes suffice. Maybe a replica may sometimes even be better. So here's a suggestion from an American museum curator with the American History Museum, Stephen Lubar. He suggests that sometimes there's a higher truth that you get not from authentic objects, but from the curatorial understanding of what the truth was that you're trying to explain. He says, well, a historical home, for instance, might have to choose which is more real, showing a beat-up and old chair, on which a historical figure sat, or a modern reproduction that better approximates what the chair was like in its heyday, or maybe even a photograph of the chair. He thinks that a lot of it's down to the kind of story that you're trying to tell, and that we need to distinguish between, as it were, the authenticity of the story that comes across, which allows people to understand what was life was like at a particular time, and authenticity of the objects, and that sometimes you can get a more authentic story by having less authentic objects. But I guess there's also cases where we think that, well, any inauthenticity of the objects might sort of detract from the authenticity of the story. So, a kind of obvious example might be something like, say, a Holocaust museum, or where you're trying to document an atrocity. In those kind of cases, museum curators are usually incredibly careful to make sure that everything in that museum can be sort of shown to be precisely have been used or part of that story, just because I guess maybe when something has that degree of moral seriousness, people are sort of worried about creating any sense of inauthenticity of story by inauthenticity of objects. But that's maybe something we can discuss further. Now, if we come back to the idea of kind of wonder, something like the old kind of amazing crown or the beautiful painting. Now, I guess this is a tricky case for thinking about genuineness. Now, I think in loads of cases, it may be that it's partly the kind of materials that something's made from, so the sheer number of, amount of sort of gold and jewels on a crown, or just the sheer skill of a painter in someone like sort of Rembrandt or other great painters. So it might be the craftsmanship that we wonder. But we'll come later to the thought, well, what would happen if we could precisely replicate exactly what the thing looked like? Should we sort of wonder at the replica as well? Or perhaps alternatively, you might think that maybe what we're marvelling at is just the apparent uniqueness and irreplaceability. So that maybe some people have the thought that, well, it's the sheer fact that particular object has existed all that time, and I'm now seeing it, and I can now almost touch it. That's what gives me the sense of wonder. I think that's what we need to interrogate and think through a bit more for the rest of the talk. So, the American philosopher Caroline Korsmeyer has written a lot on this topic. And so she's tried to defend, using the tools of analytic philosophy, the idea that there's something of great sort of ethical and aesthetic importance of being in contact with genuine old things. I want to explain some of her arguments, and we can sort of think for ourselves, do we find them convincing? Do the kind of experiences she tells us about resonate with us? And if so, how should we explain those experiences? So she aims to articulate and to justify this sort of intuition that many people have, that there's something important about encounters with objects that she says are not only old, but real, the very objects that have endured over time. So, one challenge is, which Korsmeyer admits, and which she thinks is the core thing that she needs to explain in her account, is that even if it's true that genuineness does have some kind of real aesthetic significance, whether any particular item is genuine or not doesn't seem to be detectable at all via means of the senses. That was one of the reasons for starting with things like the fake house painting, where if you could have the world's greatest experts on a topic examining a painting and looking at it as closely as they like, and nobody can tell whether it's genuine or not, then there's a sort of weirdness in saying, well, but whether it's genuine or not really makes a real difference if nobody can tell whether it's genuine or not. So that's the trickiness in Korsmeyer's position. She needs to be able to make a good argument for the claim that it really matters whether something is genuine or not, even though she admits that often it's extremely difficult to tell whether in fact something is genuine. So I want to suggest that the use of placebos in medicine might be a possible analogy for us to think about the role of genuineness. So within medicine, it's well known that the mere fact that you think that you're receiving treatment, in fact, helps you get better. So that it can often happen if you feel there's something wrong with you, that merely going to see the doctor and the doctor prescribes you a drug, part of what makes you better is just the thought that you're receiving medical treatment. And so that one of the things that you have to do if you're testing a new drug because of that is you test the new drug against a placebo. That's an inert subject which doesn't do anything. So the placebo pill might just be an empty shell, or it maybe has a little bit of sugar in it, nothing that does anything. And so they test new drugs against placebo in circumstances where neither the doctors nor the patients know whether they're getting the real drug or the placebo. And you can only bring a new drug onto the market in the West, in places where they have this regime, if you can show that your drug is more effective than a placebo. And I guess what I want to float with you as an idea is this sort of value of genuineness. Is it sort of like a placebo effect? And I think it's true that sort of if you know that if you're told that this is the very chair that Kant sat in, you probably kind of think about it differently than if it was just any old chair. But similarly, if you think that something is real or genuine, that makes a difference to the way that to your experience when you see it in the museum. But what I'm going to suggest to you is that maybe there's nothing to it over and above our belief that it's genuine. So it's a kind of placebo effect. In the same way, the placebo effect of thinking that you have getting genuine treatment from the doctor helps you get better. Similarly, believing that you're seeing something genuine, real, and old, it helps you to have an intense and valuable artistic experience, even though it's just your belief that's doing that rather than anything in the object itself. Or at least that's my hypothesis. You may well disagree with that. And this is something that Korsmeyer fervently disagrees with. So she thinks that genuineness is a sort of a real property of objects. And I'll give you an example that she has, which I think hopefully you'll have a sense of what she means, and whether you'll sort of agree with her intuition here or not, with maybe something we can discuss. She says, you can replicate an object to look genuine, but the thrill is stirred by an artifact that really is, in brackets, believed to be the real thing that has endured over time. So here's one of her main examples. She says, the worn grooves in the stone streets of Ostia Antica, which is an ancient port of Rome, invite you to step into the very places where Romans once drove their wagons and chariots. She says, tripping over a chariot rut is rather thrilling and quite different from stepping over a pothole. Just for a moment you've stumbled over, almost into, the past. The sheer physicality of the experience and the movement of one's own body are elements of this aesthetic operation of touch. So that she thinks we're sort of literally in touch with the past when you trip over an old sort of rut in the road, or there are other places in the world where you can find that there are fossilised footprints of dinosaurs, and she talks about going to stand in the footprints of where the big dinosaur had once stood. And there's Georg Simmel, the German sociologist, has a famous little essay called The Ruin, where he sort of provides a very sort of evocative description of this. He says, in the case of the ruin, like a ruined old castle, he says, the fact that life with its wealth and its changes once dwelled here constitutes an immediately perceived presence. This is also the charm of antiquities, of which only a narrow-minded logic can assert that an absolutely exact imitation equals them in aesthetic value. No matter if we are deceived in an individual case, with this piece we are holding in our hand, we command in spirit the entire span of time since its inception. The past with its destinies and transformations has been gathered into this instant in an aesthetically perceptible presence. So he has this thought that if you're holding like an old piece of pottery or an old sword that's been used for hundreds of years, somehow, just by touching it, you're sort of somehow in contact with the past. So that's what he thinks, and we might well say, well, is he right about that, or is it just an old story? So here, I guess, is one of the most controversial cases, certainly in the UK, sort of the Parthenon marbles, which are a matter of a great dispute between the Greek government and the UK government. And that certainly when you look at them now, you see, well, obviously, some of them have lost their heads. For the 2,000, or 2,500 years old, they've clearly become very damaged in the meantime. But if you believe Simmel, then you might think that maybe part of their current value is about that story, about the fact that these are the very same marbles that would have stood there at the time when Socrates was walking around, and they've stood there all that time, and the fact that they've lost their heads and their hands since then, that's part of their current value, and in seeing them in this derelict state, we sort of somehow appreciate all that span of history since then. You might alternatively think that maybe it would be better to do what they used to do in Renaissance times, when they found an old Greek or Roman statue, and then just build some new bits and add some hands and heads back onto it so it looked complete. Maybe that's something we should talk about. Now, I think that Korsmeyer has a very interesting argument, but that often within philosophy we can ask whether an argument proves too much. That's to say that if the argument is correct, does it have implications that seem weird or unwanted or implausible? And I want to suggest that Korsmeyer's account seems to depend on on keeping in mind some features of an object's history, but somehow ignoring others, and that maybe this makes the account a bit sort of arbitrary and even a bit unstable. So, if Korsmeyer is right that maybe, the tracks of an old Roman cart are impressive because they've been there all that time, how about a tree that's been there for hundreds of years? Or maybe there's some trees in England which have been over 2,000 years old. There are probably some equally old ones in China. I didn't bother to check. And similarly, if dinosaur footprints are impressive in that way, there are loads of the things we just take for granted. So like chalk or limestone, most of the rock in the world is hundreds of millions of years old. Does that make it incredibly impressive and awesome? And if you go on, then you realise that in fact this just doesn't end. So if you think about something like a gold ring, now anything that's made out of heavy elements like gold, it's in fact being forged in the heart of a star somewhere else in a solar system hundreds of millions, probably billions of years ago. And that's kind of awesome when you think about it, but does that mean that when you hold a gold ring somehow you're in contact with everything that's happened to that piece of gold in the last few billion years since it formed in the heart of a star? Well, I don't know, you might think the answer is yes, but it seems implausible to me. And one other thing to note here is, whereas Korsmeyer very much draws our attention to cases where she thinks that it's important that we're in contact with the very same thing that existed all along, there's lots of cases where we think things can be aesthetically important, where everybody knows that they exist in multiple different copies at the same time, and that what makes them the thing they are doesn't really depend on a causal history. So think about, say, kind of poems or novels or movies. Those things are often known as kind of multiples. So in those cases, obviously you can have a kind of, we think you can have an authentic, genuine experience in front of a powerful movie or a great piece of poetry, despite the fact that, as it were, that that particular DVD or your might just have been made yesterday, or you're streaming it from the internet. So whilst Korsmeyer might be right that sometimes sort of this genuineness of causal history makes a difference, it doesn't seem to be a necessary feature for our aesthetic experience. So this is, I guess, one of the earliest pieces of surviving art. This is from the Chauvet cave in France. It's probably about, people aren't quite sure how old it is, somewhere between sort of 30,000 years old and maybe 35,000 years old. I mean, and certainly the quality of the work on the horses and the rhinoceros and so on, it's really incredibly impressive kind of artistry, particularly for the time. But the cave was discovered in 1994, and as it's an incredibly important site that they wanted to examine archaeologically, they immediately realised that it would just be completely unfeasible to open it up for tourists to actually look inside, just because people doing sort of things that humans tend to do, like breathing and stuff, it would just kind of lead to bacteria, to fungus developing, and the paintings would be ruined. So they found it, then they sort of put some equipment in there to monitor it and photograph it, but then they basically sealed up the space again. But one thing that the French government did do is they built a precise replica nearby that you can go and visit, and that basically have a very similar experience to the one that you would do if you were inside the real cave. So they carefully made it of copied the artworks very carefully, and so the size of the cave, the feel of it, the temperature is very much the same. And many people describe having a very powerful experience inside the replica cave, something that seems to them to evoke both a sense of wonder and of a resonance. Think about sort of what it means to be a human being and be in contact with all those previous bits of human history. And I guess this is a different sort of case from the terracotta warrior cases in Hamburg, because in this case, people having a powerful experience with what they know to be a replica, they're not being deceived about it. So I think this seems to be a case, and we may find lots of other ones where it seems quite possible to have sort of powerful and arresting experiences which seem kind of genuine and important to us, but where we have them in respect of replicas rather than genuine things. So I want to pass on for the last part of the talk to how this relates to some sort of quite sort of controversial and interesting questions about restitutions of cultural artifacts. That's to say, well, should some of the objects that are in big museums in places in the world, should they be sent back to the cultures that first originated them? So obviously, there's loads of reasons why this has become a sort of a huge, hugely important sort of controversial cultural issue. So that ownership and display of these great cultural treasures, it brings great prestige to states. It's a massive sort of magnet for tourism, so it brings great financial advantages to states. But ownership of these items has become quite sort of controversial for two kinds of reasons. Firstly, there's these questions about, well, in many of the cases, how were they acquired in the first place? Were they acquired fairly? Were they stolen? Were they taken in war? Was it part of Western colonialism? And the second, there's a set of question about, well, once people begin to try and explain what it is that's important about these items, what's important about museums, they usually try to end up explaining it in quite sort of general and humanistic terms about just it's important that everybody have access to these kind of objects or this kind of understanding, which in fact pushes us, we might think, towards a suggestion that maybe we should be distributing these items a bit more broadly around the world rather than just holding nearly all of them in places like New York and Paris and London. And so I think that what we've seen so far could actually help us to make some progress in debates about restitution, because nearly all the debates about restitution tend to presuppose that it's somehow the genuine, the original items that really matter, and because it's these genuine original items with their particular causal history, each of those items can only be in one place at one time, so that if the British Museum has the Parthenon marbles, they can't simultaneously be in the museum in Athens, which the Greek government built to house them 20 years ago. Oops. Hopefully, I'll have to speed up. I can't. Okay. So what we've seen so far is that it's possible to have an authentic experience in response to, I think, of our imaginative reconstructions of what something would have been like, rather than to the actual things. That's what we seem to get in the case of the Chauvet cave. So if that's possible, what implications does that have for the ownership and restitution of artifacts? So here's the Parthenon marbles again. So now, Parthenon marbles taken from Greece, the UK in the early 1800s, and one of the things that makes the case quite so complicated is at the time Greece itself was actually under the control of Turkey, and so the UK got permission from the Turkish governor at the time in order to remove the artifacts, but then the Greek government now disputes that, the validity of that consent. So it's partly a legal debate, which I'm going to set on one side, but also an ethical and a debate about cultural value. So from the perspective of the Greek government, the Parthenon is one of their cultural jewels. It has immense cultural value for them, and that the statues that are currently in the British Museum are an integral part of Greek culture, and that's why it is that they feel that they need them back. Now, one thing that we could do is you could make precise replicas of them. This is actually was something that was done a couple of years ago by the Institute for Digital Archaeology in Oxford. And they actually went in without anybody noticed and did a very precise 3D digital scan of one of the Parthenon marbles in the British Museum. And then they used basically a robotic arm to sort of very, very precisely make a replica of it and then finished by hand. And they made it of the very same marble that the pentelic marble which the Parthenon itself is made of. So precise replica made of the same materials. And the people who performed this project, they suggested, I loved it, the way they summed it. When people both want the same cake and a second identical cake, and baking a second identical cake is one obvious solution. So they suggested that, well, if we make some replicas, then you could have the replicas in the UK and then just send the originals back to Greece. The only thing that would be missing was this genuineness, which, whatever it is, we saw it's a bit difficult to pin down. And I guess if you wanted to, when you were sort of making the replicas, you could probably also improve them. If we noticed that they're missing hands, arms, various other things, there's chips, there's imperfections on the marble, you could also clean that up. So there may be ways in which you could argue that the copies would be better than the originals. Now, I guess it probably won't surprise you to hear that the British government was not particularly happy about this particular suggestion. We can only speculate on why. And so maybe one thing this tells us is that at the heart of a lot of these disputes, there's a particular way of thinking about cultural artefacts. Is if all the different players are thinking about within the logic of private property. It's as if the artefacts are sort of unique and rival objects which have to be exclusively owned by some nation or some museum. And so obviously if you frame something as a matter of private property, then it leads to these questions about what it is to fairly own them and who gets to own them. Now, for all sorts of reasons, that kind of ends up being incredibly tricky in practice, because for any artefacts that were made more than a few centuries ago, you found that very often the national boundaries have shifted massively since then. Different sets of people may have moved in and out. There's often been wars and other sorts of things. So it's kind of not entirely clear that there is any sort of clear sense in which one and the same community has been living in the same place for the last 2,000 or 3,000 years. So that the current Egyptian government, for example, has pressed quite hard internationally. Say, well, there's all the places that have Egyptian antiquities. They say, well, we'd like those back. And one question that's been raised against that is, well, so what's the right kind of connection to have in order to be able to make a claim of restitution? And so that I think that Thompson, who makes this claim, is maybe a little bit overstating it, but certainly you might raise the question that she asked, which is, well, does the mere fact that those in Egypt now are sort of on the same piece of territory as those, as 2,000 or 3,000 years ago, those who built the pyramids were, is that enough to say that somehow we're one and the same community, we want those back, as opposed to saying, well, these are part of the general cultural treasures of humankind, which we should arrange in a way so that everybody can see them and benefit from them. And so one way of making sense of what a museum should be for and how to distribute items has been the idea of the universal museum, and the places where there are these sort of huge collections from across the world, whether sort of Paris and London, New York, have often claimed there's a sort of incredible sort of cultural importance in the very idea of the universal museum, the idea that there's somewhere you can go where you could see sort of artifacts from all across the world from different cultural periods, so you can study them together. And they say museums serve not just the citizens of one nation, but the people of every nation. Museums are agents in the development of culture, whose mission is to foster knowledge by continuous process of reinterpretation. Each object contributes to that process. To narrow the focus of museums whose collections are diverse and multifaceted would therefore be a disservice to all visitors. Now, even if we agree with that argument about the importance of universal museums, it's hard not to notice where the leading universal museums in the world currently are. They're places like London, New York, and Paris. So that even if we agree that universal museums play a vital role in the development of culture, we might ask if it's acceptable that somehow, that just as a matter of chance, they should be overwhelmingly cited in wealthy countries. And that just as very great disparities in wealth, either between countries or between citizens, raise questions about whether there should be some form of redistributive taxation. So we might think that this massive global inequality in the current distribution of cultural artefacts may also lead to some claims for sort of greater redistribution. So to give you just one example, the British Museum in London currently holds, according to its own records, at least 8 million items. Not all of those have properly been catalogued, and in fact, only 80,000 of those are on display at any one time in the British Museum, so that less than about 1% of what they hold is actually on display. And that they do lend items to other universities around the world, but they usually only lend about 4,000 items per year. And so basically, there's 99% of their collection is currently not being display. So it's hard not to imagine that there might be some potential for greater redistribution of these items around the world if you think that the Universal Museum is a real thing and the promise of aiding understanding across the world is an important one to achieve. And certainly it doesn't seem that the British Museum might lose anything very significant if it were sort of to allow sort of 4 million of its items to exit the door. So I wanted to sort of end with a couple of conclusions. There's a famous quote that people often use within sort of sociology from the W.I. and D.S. Thomas nearly 100 years ago, and they say, if men define situations as real, they are real in their consequences, which is a kind of subtle way of saying that often, even if something doesn't have any sort of separate existence, it can be sort of important for the way people view the world. And so we've seen that a number of the practices around kind of art and museums we have make this idea of genuineness certainly real in its consequences at the moment. But we've seen only relatively weak reasons to think that the value of genuineness goes beyond such social construction. So if we wanted to claim that the value of genuineness goes beyond the idea that it's sort of real in its consequences, we'd need to provide an argument for why it is that genuineness actually matters in itself. And we saw that Caroline Korsmeyer attempted to provide such an argument, but we found it sort of not entirely convincing. And I guess those who are sort of art historians would obviously be aware that someone like sort of Walter Benjamin sort of argued, in the work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, suggests that, well, it may be helpful to think about this historically. His thought was that, well, it's only with the coming of mass reproducibility via photographs, via books, that people start sort of thinking about originals in different sort of ways. He thought that the coming of this idea of aura and of genuineness was partly a response to the ease of reproduction of items, so that for him it was largely socially constructed, which made him somewhat sceptical of it. And I think it's certainly also true that we can find cultural traditions in which genuineness seems to play little or no role. And indeed, if you look back further in Western culture, it was there's quite a long period after the decline of the Roman Empire where people didn't really think anything about these old temples. They just thought they were useful for getting stone for building their houses. It's only in about 1500 that people rediscovered the idea of antiquity and archaeology and so on, and wanted to say, well, no, these ruins need to be preserved. And one thing I think we've also discovered, I hope, is that, well, if it's true that genuineness doesn't really seem to matter in itself, this might provide us with good reasons to make sort of more frequent, maybe more self-conscious and non-deceptive use of replicas within our museums. If we think that, in fact, we can allow people to have the right kind of experiences that we're looking for, of resonance, of wonder, just through replicas, so long, and just if we're honest about that. And one beneficial effect of that, if it turns out that genuineness doesn't really matter, is that, well, maybe that if genuineness doesn't really matter and it turns out to be not as difficult as we thought to sort of replicate artworks, maybe we can do this digital scanning and then have robots carve new sculptures for us. Then maybe every city could have its own universal museum. So you wouldn't need to travel to London or eventually Athens to see the Parthenon marbles. You wouldn't need to go to Rome to see Michelangelo's David. But if genuineness does really matter, then I think we can still ask some important questions about how it is that these important and genuine artifacts should be redistributed. So that if we think that the purposes of a museum is to secure access to knowledge and to further human understanding, then you might think, well, surely you might be able to do that more powerfully by ensuring that those rare and irreplaceable artifacts are placed in places around the world that are easier for people to access. So thank you. Well, luckily I lasted almost to the end. Thank you.